Dearest Francis, if something happens to me, look for the safe deposit box at First National Bank under the name Norma Jean Baker. Inside you'll find everything, the photographs, the recordings, the letters. Jack and Bobby think they can silence me, but I've made sure the truth will survive even if I don't. Frank Sinatra's hands were trembling as he read Marilyn Monroe's handwritten letter for the 5th time, the elegant script blurring through tears he hadn't shed since childhood. It was July 30th, 1962, just 5 days before the world would wake up to news of Marilyn's death, and America's most famous sex symbol had just handed Frank the most dangerous insurance policy in Hollywood history. The letter had arrived that morning by special courier delivered to Frank's Palm Springs compound with strict instructions that it be placed directly into his hands. No assistant, no secretary, no bodyguard, just Frank. Marilyn had been that specific about the delivery, which should have been Frank's first clue that whatever was in that envelope was worth killing for. Frank had known Marilyn for over a decade, since her early days as a studio contract player when she was still Norma Jean Baker from small-town Ohio, desperate to become somebody in a town that chewed up pretty girls and spit them out when they got too old or too smart for their own good. He'd watched her transform herself from an insecure blonde into the most desired woman in America, but he'd also seen the price that transformation had demanded. What the public didn't know was that Frank and Marilyn had been secret allies since 1954, bound together not by romance but by survival, in a world where fame was power and power was dangerous. Frank had connections to organized crime that made him valuable to politicians, and Marilyn had access to those same politicians that made her valuable to Frank's associates. They'd created a mutually beneficial arrangement that had kept them both alive and prosperous for 8 years. But now, reading her letter in the desert silence of his compound, Frank realized that their carefully balanced world was about to collapse. "Francis," the letter continued, "I need you to know that everything I told you about Jack and Bobby was true. The meetings at Peter's house, the private calls to my apartment, the promises they made about divorcing their wives, all of it was real. But what I didn't tell you was that I've been recording everything. Every conversation, every intimate moment, every political secret they shared when they thought I was just another dumb blonde who'd keep her mouth shut." Frank set the letter down and poured himself a Jack Daniels, his mind racing through the implications of what Marilyn was telling him. If she had recordings of her affairs with both Kennedy brothers, if she had documented evidence of their private conversations about government business, she was sitting on enough political dynamite to bring down the entire administration. The Kennedy brothers' relationship with Marilyn had always been dangerous, but Frank had assumed it was just the usual Washington hypocrisy, powerful men who preached family values while cheating on their wives with movie stars. But if Marilyn had been smart enough to record those encounters, if she had evidence of political discussions that violated national security, she'd crossed a line that men like the Kennedys didn't allow anyone to cross and live. "I know what you're thinking." Marilyn's letter seemed to anticipate his concerns. "You're wondering why I would do something so dangerous, why I would risk everything by recording the president and the attorney general. The truth is, Francis, I was trying to protect myself. I knew that sooner or later they'd get tired of me, that I'd become more of a liability than an asset. I needed insurance, something to make sure they couldn't just dispose of me when I became inconvenient." Frank understood that logic perfectly. In his own dealings with powerful men, he'd learned that the only real protection was knowing secrets that could destroy them if they tried to destroy you. But Marilyn had made a crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed that her recordings would keep her safe, when in reality they'd made her the most dangerous woman in America. The letter went on to detail the contents of the safety deposit box that Marilyn had established under her real name. Along with the audio recordings, she'd collected photographs, letters, and documents that chronicled not just her affairs with the Kennedy brothers, but their discussions of everything from civil rights strategy to foreign policy decisions to personal details about their family lives. "There are pictures from that weekend at Peter's house in March," Marilyn wrote, referring to Peter Lawford's beach house, where she'd often met with Jack Kennedy away from the White House's scrutiny. "Jack thought we were alone, but I had a camera hidden in the bedroom. He told me things that night about Cuba, about the plans for Vietnam, about what they really think of civil rights leaders like Dr. King. He was trying to impress me, to show me how powerful he was. He had no idea I was collecting evidence. Frank realized that Marilyn had been playing a much more sophisticated game than anyone had suspected. While the world saw her as a blonde bombshell who'd gotten lucky by catching the president's eye, she'd actually been conducting a systematic intelligence-gathering operation that would have made the CIA proud. But the most damaging revelations in the letter involved Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General who'd been leading the government's crackdown on organized crime while secretly visiting Marilyn at her Brentwood home. Marilyn had documented conversations where Bobby had discussed ongoing federal investigations, shared details about wiretapping operations, and even revealed the names of informants who were feeding information to law enforcement. Bobby thinks he's so righteous going after the mob while sleeping with me, Marilyn had written. But he told me things that could get people killed. He gave me names of informants, details about federal operations, even advance warning about raids that were being planned. I have it all on tape, Francis. Every hypocritical word. Frank understood immediately why Marilyn had felt the need to write this letter. If Bobby Kennedy discovered that his pillow talk had been recorded, that his private conversations about federal law enforcement operations had been documented by a woman with connections to the very criminals he was prosecuting, the Attorney General would have no choice but to treat Marilyn as a national security threat. The letter's final pages contained detailed instructions for accessing the safety deposit box, along with Marilyn's wishes for what should be done with the evidence if something happened to her. She'd clearly been planning for the possibility of her own death, which meant she understood better than anyone how dangerous her situation had become. If I don't survive this, Francis, I want you to decide what to do with the evidence. You understand this world better than anyone. You know how these powerful men operate, how they dispose of problems that threaten them. Use what I've collected to protect yourself, or use it to expose them. Just don't let them bury the truth along with me. Frank finished reading the letter as the sun was setting over the desert, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed prophetic. He'd built his career on understanding dangerous men and navigating treacherous relationships, but even he was shocked by the scope of what Marilyn had accomplished. She'd managed to compromise the two most powerful men in America while they thought they were using her. But Frank also understood that Marilyn's insurance policy had become her death warrant. The recordings and photographs she'd collected were too dangerous for anyone to possess, and too valuable for the Kennedy brothers to allow them to exist. If they discovered what she'd been doing, they'd have no choice but to silence her permanently. Frank's phone rang that evening, interrupting his thoughts about Marilyn's letter. It was Peter Lawford calling from his beach house with news that made Frank's blood run cold. "Frank, we got a problem." Peter's voice was tight with anxiety. "Bobby's been asking questions about Marilyn, about her apartment, about what kind of security setup she has. He wants to know who has keys, who's been visiting her, who she's been talking to. This doesn't sound like jealousy, Pally. This sounds like damage control." Frank understood immediately. The Kennedy brothers had discovered Marilyn's recordings, or at least suspected their existence. They were moving into crisis mode, preparing to contain a security breach that could destroy their political careers, and quite possibly land them in federal prison. "Peter, listen to me carefully," Frank said. "You need to stay away from Marilyn for the next few days. Don't call her, don't visit her, don't have any contact with her at all. And whatever you do, don't mention to anyone that I called you." "Frank, what's going on? You're scaring me." "I can't explain right now, but Marilyn is in serious danger. The kind of danger that people don't usually survive." Frank hung up and immediately called his own security chief, a former FBI agent named Murphy, who understood the difference between protecting someone and preparing for war. "Murphy, I need you to put a team on Marilyn Monroe. 24-hour surveillance, but keep them invisible. I want to know who's watching her, who's approaching her house, who's making contact with her. And Murphy, arm your people. This isn't a babysitting job." "What kind of threat are we looking at, Mr. Sess?" "The kind that comes from the highest levels of government when national security is involved." Over the next 4 days, Murphy's team reported a steady escalation of activity around Marilyn's Brentwood home. Black cars with government plates had been spotted in the neighborhood. Men in suits had been asking questions about Marilyn's daily routine. Most ominously, the telephone company had received requests to install maintenance equipment on her phone lines, equipment that looked suspiciously like wiretapping technology. Frank realized that the Kennedy brothers weren't just planning to silence Marilyn, they were conducting a full intelligence operation to determine the scope of her recordings and identify anyone else who might be compromised. If they discovered Frank's name in Marilyn's records, if they found evidence of his own conversations with her about political matters, he could become their next target. On August 4, 1962, Frank received a call from Murphy that confirmed his worst fears. "Mr. S., we've got federal agents moving toward the subject's location. Multiple vehicles, coordinated approach. This isn't surveillance anymore, this is an operation." Frank tried calling Marilyn's house, but the phone just rang and rang. He tried again 30 minutes later, then an hour later, but there was never an answer. Murphy's team reported that the federal vehicles had entered Marilyn's property and remained there for several hours before leaving in the early morning darkness. At 4:25 a.m. on August 5, 1962, Frank received the call he'd been dreading. "Mr. C, the subject is down. Official word is drug overdose, but my people saw body bags being removed from the property. Plural. More than one person died in that house tonight." Frank understood immediately. The Kennedy brothers hadn't just eliminated Marilyn, they'd eliminated everyone who might have been with her, anyone who might have witnessed what really happened. It was a cleanup operation designed to remove all evidence and all witnesses to whatever Marilyn had been planning to reveal. But Frank also knew that Marilyn had been smarter than her killers realized. The safety deposit box at First National Bank was still waiting, filled with evidence that could destroy the Kennedy administration if Frank chose to use it. Marilyn's final gift to him was the power to avenge her death, or to protect himself from suffering the same fate. Frank waited a full year before visiting the bank. When he finally opened Marilyn's safety deposit box in July 1963, he found exactly what she'd promised: dozens of audio reels, photographs, letters, and documents that chronicled the Kennedy brothers' most intimate secrets and most damaging admissions. Listening to those recordings, Frank heard the voices of two men who'd believed they were untouchable, who'd shared state secrets with a woman they'd assumed was too naive to understand their significance. But Marilyn had understood everything, and she documented it all with the thoroughness of a professional intelligence agent. The photographs were even more damaging than the audio recordings. They showed Jack Kennedy in compromising positions, but more importantly, they showed him in private meetings with advisors, handling classified documents, making decisions that were supposed to be secret. Marilyn had somehow managed to photograph some of the most sensitive moments of his presidency. But the most explosive evidence was a letter in Bobby Kennedy's handwriting, apparently given to Marilyn during one of their private encounters. In it, the Attorney General had detailed his plans for expanding federal surveillance of civil rights leaders, including specific instructions for wiretapping Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s private communications. Frank realized that Marilyn had died not just because she'd been sleeping with the President and Attorney General, but because she'd uncovered evidence of government operations that violated the constitutional rights of American citizens. She'd stumbled onto a conspiracy that went far beyond sexual hypocrisy and into the realm of actual treason. For the rest of his life, Frank kept Marilyn's evidence locked away, using it not for revenge but for protection. Whenever government pressure on his own activities became too intense, whenever federal investigations into his mob connections threatened to become serious, Frank would arrange for subtle reminders to reach the right people that he possessed information that could bring down the Kennedy legacy forever. The first time Frank used Marilyn's insurance policy was in 1964, when Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department launched a massive investigation into Frank's business dealings with Las Vegas casinos. Federal agents had raided Frank's offices, seized his financial records, and were preparing criminal charges that could have sent him to prison for decades. Frank's lawyer arranged a private meeting with a Justice Department official, during which a single photograph was placed on the conference table, a picture of Bobby Kennedy leaving Marilyn's Brentwood home at 2 a.m., taken just weeks before her death. No words were exchanged, no threats were made, but within 48 hours the federal investigation into Frank's activities was quietly terminated. The beautiful thing about Marilyn's evidence, Frank confided to his security chief years later, is that it never gets old. The Kennedy brothers might think they buried their secrets with her, but dead secrets have a way of coming back to life when the right person knows where to dig. Frank's use of Marilyn's materials wasn't limited to protecting himself from government prosecution. In 1968, when Robert Kennedy was running for president, Frank faced pressure from organized crime figures who wanted him to use his influence to damage Bobby's campaign. Sam Giancana's successors believed that Frank owed them a favor for all the protection they'd provided over the years. "They wanted me to destroy Bobby Kennedy," Frank later told Dean Martin during one of their few reconciliations. "They figured I had enough dirt on him to end his political career permanently. And they were right. I had enough evidence to destroy not just Bobby but the entire Kennedy family legacy." But Frank made a calculated decision that surprised everyone who knew about his mob connections. Instead of using Marilyn's evidence to destroy Bobby Kennedy, he used it to protect him from other potential threats. Frank understood that Kennedy's survival was essential to the continued value of Marilyn's insurance policy. Dead politicians couldn't be blackmailed, but living ones could be controlled. When Bobby Kennedy was assassinated in June 1968, Frank lost more than just a political figure he'd learned to manipulate through Marilyn's evidence. He lost the primary target that gave her recordings their ultimate value. Without Bobby Kennedy alive to be threatened by exposure, much of Marilyn's intelligence became historically interesting but politically worthless. However, Frank discovered that Marilyn's evidence had value beyond just controlling the Kennedy brothers. The recordings and documents she'd collected also contained references to other powerful figures, politicians, intelligence officials, even foreign diplomats who'd been present during some of her encounters with the Kennedys. One particularly valuable recording captured a conversation between Jack Kennedy and CIA Director Allen Dulles that took place in Marilyn's presence during a private party at Peter Lawford's house. The men had apparently forgotten that Marilyn was in the room, or assumed she was too intoxicated to understand their discussion about ongoing operations in Cuba and Vietnam. Marilyn was smarter than any of them realized, Frank reflected years later. They saw a blonde bombshell and assumed she was harmless, but she was collecting intelligence that could have changed the course of American foreign policy if it had ever been made public. Frank's careful management of Marilyn's legacy extended beyond just using her evidence for protection. He also made sure that certain details about her death were never fully investigated, understanding that too much scrutiny of her final days might lead investigators to discover the safety deposit box and its explosive contents. When various conspiracy theorists and investigative journalists began looking into Marilyn's death in the 1970s and 1980s, Frank used his connections to ensure that their inquiries never got too close to the truth. He arranged for certain witnesses to become unavailable, for key documents to disappear, and for official investigations to reach conclusions that protected both Marilyn's reputation and the secrets she died trying to preserve. "The irony," Frank once told his daughter Nancy, "is that I spent 40 years protecting Marilyn's secrets better than she'd ever been able to protect them herself. She died trying to use those recordings to save her life, but I used them to build a fortress that kept both our secrets safe forever." In his final years, Frank made arrangements for Marilyn's evidence to be destroyed after his death, understanding that the secrets had served their purpose and no longer needed to survive. The safety deposit box was emptied in 1999, and its contents were incinerated by a private security firm that specialized in destroying sensitive materials. Frank never revealed the full contents of Marilyn's safety deposit box, but he made sure that the right people knew it existed. It became his ultimate insurance policy, protection against a government that had proven willing to murder its own citizens to protect its secrets. Marilyn Monroe died believing that the truth would survive even if she didn't. In Frank Sinatra's hands, her final evidence became a weapon that kept both of them safe from beyond the grave. Her legacy protected by his survival, and his survival protected by her truth. If this shocking story of political conspiracy and ultimate betrayal moved you, show your appreciation with a like, because some secrets are so dangerous that they can only be protected by the threat of mutual destruction. What do you think? Should Frank have exposed the Kennedy brothers, or was he right to use Marilyn's evidence as protection? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the golden age of Hollywood, where love affairs with presidents could be a death sentence.